Hello and welcome to my channel Polyglot Reading. My name is David, and on my channel I usually present classics of the German, English, Italian, French or Yiddish literature. Classics that I usually try to read in their original language and which I would like to bring to the attention also of readers of other languages. Today I would like to present the novel An Iceland Fisherman by the French author Pierre Loti. I made a video about another novel by Pierre Loti a couple of months ago. I'll put a link to the video here. I made a video about his novel of a Child, and this Novel of a Child, I think, is a very good introduction to the work of Pierre Loti. It is certainly the most relevant of his novels in terms of literary history, due to its reception and impact, because with this concept of reconstructing childhood memories to understand one's own character and personality, he had a decisive influence on subsequent French authors of the early 20th centuries, such as Alain Fournier for his novel The Great Morn, published in 1912, or also on Marcel Proust with his monumental novel In Search of Lost Time. Today, however, I'm going to talk about a different novel, perhaps not quite as important, but surely among the many novels that Pierre Loti wrote, this is the one that is still worth to be read today. But first of all, let me say a few words about the life and times of the author Pierre Loti himself. Pierre Loti is just his pen name. He was born in 1850 as Louis-Marie Julien Viau, as son of a seafaring family. His father was a ship's doctor, and seafaring and above all traveling the world to far-off countries held a tremendous fascination for Pierre Loti from his earliest childhood. And so during all his lifetime, he was a restless traveler, always on the move, and he was able to turn this passion also into his profession to some extent by becoming a naval officer, and in this capacity he was taking part in numerous foreign deployments and expeditions to the Orient, to China and Japan. And so also this is reflected in his writing. The majority of his novels are also written in the form of fictional travel reports, which became real bestsellers due to the fascination with the exotic that was widespread in France at the end of the 19th century. My personal impression is that quite a few of his books were successful mainly because they perfectly addressed the literary taste of his time, this hunger for the exotic, and part of it, at least outside France, was later forgotten or received in a more critical way because these novels were accused of what we call now exoticism, that is the accusation of disguising literary weakness by dressing stories up in exotic settings, and most of all by reporting on foreign cultures, not without stereotypes, but by looking at them from a distinctly European or Eurocentric perspective, even with some sort of attitude of supremacy. And I do not consider this label exotism to be entirely justified, at least not when it has this negative connotation, because unlike other fashion writers of his time, Pierre Loti wrote about countries and cultures that he had actually traveled to and got to know firsthand. And furthermore, exotism can also be a clever literary means to convey critical messages in a somewhat more subtle way under the guise of alienation. But let's move on to the novel that this video is about, An Iceland Fisherman. I briefly mentioned the book in my video about my visit to the impressive antiquarian bookshop Hatry in Heidelberg in this video, where I came across this beautiful edition of the German translation from 1912, published by Gustav Kiepenheuer publishers in Weimar, beautifully bound in dark blue suede with blind embossing on the book cover. And so due to this beautiful edition, contrary to my usual ambition, I read the book not in the French original, but in this beautiful German edition. Yeah, now there are also English translations available, usually published under the title The Iceland Fisherman or An Iceland Fisherman. And this novel is sort of unusual for Pierre Loti because it is largely free of exotic elements. It essentially describes a friendship and a love story between three young people from a fishing village on the coast in Brittany, in northern France, people who belonged to the so-called Iceland fishers. And Loti in this novel gives us an authentic and regionally and culturally interesting insight into the lives of these Iceland fishermen, the hard-working day-to-day life of the men who went fishing and the hardship of their families and especially the women. Iceland fishers were small boats with a small crew that set sail from the coastal towns of Brittany in February in large numbers to fish for months on end in the rough waters of the coast of Iceland. And so for up to 8 months, from February till September, before the autumn storms began, the Iceland fishermen stayed in the northern waters, working in shifts around the clock to catch, to slaughter, and to salt codfish day in, day out. And for 8 months, husbands, fathers, brothers, and uncles were absent, and life at home had to be managed by the women. And everyone was very well aware that the fishermen during these 8 months led a life really balanced on knife's edge. In their hometowns in September, October, every year really an anxiety began. Whether all those who had set out would really come back, would return. And far too often, one of the ships failed to return at the end of the season, often without anyone ever knowing when, where, or why it had shipwrecked and sunk. And so in every fishing family, there was one or more husband, father, brother who had stayed at sea. And in many places along the coast, there were chapels whose walls were covered with memorial plaques telling the stories of those who had disappeared at sea. This is also the case in the small town of Paimpol, which is at the center of this story. And this place, Paimpol, still actually exists in Brittany, in France. It is a real coastal town with a tradition dating back to the 15th century as a home port for Iceland fishers. And so this is not the case anymore today. It is a town that lives more from tourists, and it has a small marina, but there's also a museum about the local history of Iceland fisher. And of course, lots of places are named after Pierre Loti due to the popularity that the town got through this novel, The Iceland Fisherman. In this novel, Loti introduces us to this milieu of Iceland fishermen in Paimpol, and he tells us a double story of friendship and love under these conditions. The first male protagonist is the young fisherman Jean, or Jan, as he is called in the local dialect. And Jan is a good-natured but unpredictable and somewhat stubborn fellow, not yet fully mature. He enjoys little love affairs here and there in the harbor towns, but he does not want to commit himself yet, and he's always joking that one day he will celebrate his wedding with the sea, which is a somewhat disturbing death metaphor, I think. He is close friends with Sylvester, the fiancé of one of his sisters, and Sylvester is the younger, gentler, and more affectionate one of the two, and in many ways still more childlike, but on the other hand, he also seems to be the more emotionally stable one of the two. And there has been some speculation as to whether Loti is alluding to a homoerotic relationship between Jan and Sylvester here. I cannot decide on that. There are some descriptions of somewhat more intimate gestures of friendship between the two, such as sitting on deck with their arms entwined. But Loti does not get any more explicit than that. And I'm not sure how close or how far this is from regular local customs among good friends in northern France at that time. The first element of tension or the drama is foreshadowed when Sylvester is drafted into the Navy. Service, which at that time in France lasted 5 years, which is a very long time for a young fellow of, let's say, 20 years. And since France was at that time involved in military conflicts in China and Taiwan, it was clear that this would also be a quite risky journey with an uncertain outcome. The third character in the novel is Maud. She is the daughter of a merchant from Paimpol who had achieved a certain level of prosperity and therefore also lived and raised his daughter in Paris for a few years. So Maud spent her childhood and youth in Paris. She is a real city girl. And she is now being transplanted to Paimpol because her father wants to return to his hometown. But it's not just the geographical distance between Paimpol and Paris that is huge, a journey of several days back then. There's also a cultural divide between Paris and Paimpol that feels like a distance of centuries. And God is a stranger in Paimpol. She is struggling to adjust to the provincial life with its peculiar structures and traditions. And in turn, she is often viewed with some suspicion by the locals who accuse her of metropolitan arrogance, even though she's not at all guilty of that. She's a very honest and humble character. God and Jan fall in love with each other, but the difference in their social status and Jan's stubbornness and his love of freedom, his love of the sea, of his life with his fellow fishermen and friends on the ships, all this makes it difficult for God and Jan to actually get together. And the novel's plot revolves around the friendship um, and relationship between these three people, with the sea and seafaring as a constant threat in the background and as a kind of competitor for Jan's love and affection and destiny. And Loti's particular strength for me is in his ability to describe in a very vivid and atmospherically gripping way the ambivalence between the fascination and the horror of life as a fisherman and the forces of nature at sea. Loti is an author who can both describe nature scenes very much in detail, but he can also evoke atmosphere, moods, and impressive images of nature with just a few sentences or even fragments of sentences without explicitly explaining everything. To illustrate a bit the writing style of Pierre Loti, I will read a few abstracts from the first chapters of the novel. There they were, 5 huge square-built seamen, drinking away together in the dismal cabin, which reeked of fish pickle and bilge water. The overhead beams came down too low for the tall statures, and rounded off at one end so as to resemble a gull's breast seen from within. The whole rolled gently with a monotonous wail, inclining one slowly to drowsiness. Outside, beyond doubt, lay the sea and the night, but one could not be quite sure of that, for a single opening in the deck was closed by its weather hatch, and the only light came from an old hanging lamp swinging to and fro. A fire shone in the stove, at which their saturated clothes were drying, and giving out steam that mingled with the smoke from their clay pipes. Their massive table, fitted exactly to its shape, occupied the whole space, and there was just enough room for moving around and sitting upon the narrow lockers fastened to the sides. Thick beams ran above them, very nearly touching their heads, and behind them yawned the berths, apparently hollowed out of the solid timbers, like recesses of a vault wherein to place the dead. All the wainscoting was rough and worn, impregnated with damp and salt, defaced and polished by the continual rubbings of their hands. They had been drinking wine and cider in their pannikins, and the sheer enjoyment of life lit up their frank, honest face. Now they lingered at table, chatting in Breton tongue on woman and marriage. Huddled against one another for want of space, they seemed to feel downright comfort, snugly packed in their dark home. Outside spread the ocean and night, the infinite solitude of dark, fathomless waters. A brass watch hung on the wall pointed to 11 o'clock, doubtless 11 at night, and upon the deck pattered the drizzling rain. I think the raw, primitive nature of the fisherman's workplace and daily routine is beautifully captured here. And you might think it would become a wild seafaring adventure story, but you'd be wrong. It becomes a very subtle study of relationships between the main characters and the forces of nature. And in contrast to this scene, there is also a description of life on deck with a focus on the description of nature in order to describe the almost surreal atmosphere of working at sea under the never-setting polar sun. I will read another extract of the first chapter. It was daylight, the everlasting day of those regions, a pale, dim light, resembling no other, bathing all things, like the gleams of a setting sun. Around them stretched an immense colorless waste, and excepting the planks of their ship, all seemed transparent, ethereal and fairy-like. The eye could not distinguish what the scene might be. First, it appeared as a quivering mirror that had no objects to reflect, and in the distance, it became a desert of vapor, and beyond that, a void, having neither horizon nor limits. The damp freshness of the air was more intensely penetrating than dry frost, and when breathing it, one tasted the flavor of brine. All was calm, and the rain had ceased. Overhead the clouds, without form or color, seemed to conceal the latent light that could not be explained. The eye could see clearly, yet one was still conscious of the night. This dimness was all of an indefinable hue. The boat rolled gently with its everlasting wail, as monotonous as a Breton song moaned by a sleeper. Jan and Sylvester had got their bait and lines ready, while their mate opened a barrel of salt and, whetting his long knife, went and sat behind them, waiting. He did not have to long wait, or they either. They scarcely had thrown their lines into the calm, cold water, in fact, before they drew in huge, heavy fish of a steel-grey sheen, and time after time the codfish let themselves be hooked in a rapid and unceasing silent series. The third man ripped them open with his long knife, spread them flat, salted and counted them, and piled up the lot, which upon their return would constitute their fortune, behind them, all still redly streaming and still sweet and fresh. The hours passed monotonously, while in the immeasurable empty regions beyond, the light slowly changed, till it grew less unreal. What at first had appeared a livid gloaming, like a northern summer's eve, became now, without any intervening dark hour before dawn, something like a smiling morn, reflected by all the facets of the ocean in fading, roseate-edged streaks. I hope that these two examples are suitable to give you an idea of the style that this novel is written in, and I would be delighted if I've been able to spark your interest and curiosity in rediscovering this author and this novel, An Iceland Fisherman by Pierre Loti, an author who has been almost forgotten outside of France. The novel is available in various formats, including also a very cheap Kindle version from Alpha Publishers. Please give it a try. I'm quite sure you won't regret it. So that's already the end of this video. I hope you have enjoyed it. If so, please let me know, or also write me a comment if you have read this novel or any other book of Pierre Loti. I would love very much to learn your opinion on this author. So that's it for today. See you next time. Take care. Bye and ciao.